Begin with a E then.
It's perfectly okay if you forget to record the sound this time.
I got it. I got it.
Don't forget to turn it on.
Yeah, very good.
It's on.
I don't get introduced to this, huh?
Shh. No.
Oh, my God.
All right.
Come on, Bill.
Huh? Oops. Uh-oh.
Spinning wheel down.
It's moved.
So before I start judging, let me just comment that, as usual, to me what's important are the comments. The actual numbers are really subjective. And, you know, it's always kind of like, well, maybe it should be an 11 and a half, or, you know, or oh, if I gave that one an 11, well, what should I give the other one? And so, you know, the numbers are more approximate.
I don't think your mic is working.
Oh, dear.
There
Yeah,
it goes.
I just need to stick it up my face.
I turned it up a little bit, so you don't have to stick it up your face.
Thank you. All right. Let's start off. I assume that this is long exposure assigned subjects, yes?
Yes.
Okay. And was there any rule about what constituted a long exposure?
No.
I mean, did it have to be more than X amount of time?
No.
No. Okay. Okay, well, obviously, this is a good long exposure with the sky. So let's say I'm going to go 12 with this. I love the tree and I love the long exposure on the clouds, except for the fact that with the long exposure you've got two very blown out areas. That's one of the risks with doing long exposures, is that you have to be very careful that your highlights don't get blown out as well, and calculate. And sometimes I'll do several just to make sure. The other thing with the images that I would probably vignette, just slightly darken the lower foreground to help lead your eye into the tree and then back to the clouds. But I really love the motion in the clouds.
Ooh.
15, that is very unique, very creative, and I can't think of a thing I would do differently. More power to you. I like the idea of a long exposure with the lights is good, but the trouble with this for me is that the lines lead us out on the left in two different places and on the right, and to a lesser extent on the top and bottom as well, so that it becomes very hard to know where to look and to land. Okay, I'm going home now. This is a 15, and holy cripes is this outstanding. This may be one of the most outstanding, unique images I've judged in all the years I've judged here. That said, if it were mine and I were playing with it, there is one thing I would slightly do, and that is the coming events on the right. I don't think that needed to be that much in focus, and in an ideal world, I might post-process blur a little bit of that. But that ghostly figure is just so outstanding that it takes the cake. I understand that I think somebody's considering this a long exposure because they did some light painting with it. Maybe that gives some of the color and the reflection. Compositionally, I think it would be a little stronger if we didn't have the merges on the left side and almost on the bottom. Basically, either you want to crop something like it is on the top, or you want to have some space like it is on the right, but that kind of accidental touching usually doesn't work real well. You live in a different Bayside than I do. 15 again. Wow, where'd all this creativity come from? Holy manoli. The composition's fantastic. The execution is perfect. The choice of a little yellow stroke around it works beautifully. Really well done, well conceived.
Jump in front of you.
Reaching for the stars.
Ooh.
12. Kind of a unique image and kind of an interesting concept to photograph somebody's statue. At least I assume that that's a statue. Because if it's a real live person, we might be in trouble. But if it's reaching for the stars, I would expect that in some way the stars would be lined up with her hands in a way that made them connect. Right now it just looks like she's in front of the Milky Way, and then the Milky Way has a strange vignette on the top where it suddenly gets much darker. So I think that the processing could be a little bit stronger too.
Scottish Falls.
$11 points. You know, doing waterfalls with a long exposure is kind of like the accepted way to do waterfalls. But the things that you have to be careful of are, if you look at the kind of third grouping from the right and where it's blown out, it's that, and behind it, it's the danger I mentioned before with the other image. You have to really watch that you don't lose your detail even with a long exposure. You want it to look like it does on the left side of the picture and on the bottom, that your highlights still have detail. The other problem with this image, and that happens sometimes when you're doing a long exposure waterfall, is that you're so anxious to get a long exposure that you're stopped down to f16, f22, whatever, and you end up with everything in focus. Because the trees are so sharp and in focus, I'm skipping over the waterfalls and going back to the trees. When if the waterfall is my subject, I want that tree to be background, and I don't want it to be so sharply in focus. So I would open up, maybe shoot that with a neutral density filter, but be shooting it maybe at f4 or something like that. Now I have right hand intellect to do things. Oh my God.
Paris at dusk.
$10 points. I mean, this is a nice idea to have something strong in the foreground here and then lead us over to the Eiffel Tower and this, whatever it is, the street that ends up almost looking like a giraffe if you could have my lack of 3D vision sometimes creates really weird perceptions. But at least it points to the Eiffel Tower, and that's all good. The trouble comes from the fact that this is so bright that it commands us to stay there, and that's not necessarily the most interesting part. We might like to see a little more detail in the dark areas here. And it would have been nice if the sky had been a little more cooperative for you, you know. A little bit earlier, like 15 minutes earlier, that sky might have been a lot nicer.
A hazy night in the Berg.
So we're doing nighttime long exposures here. $14 points. I think that this is really well done. It's very carefully composed so that we come down the river and go around the bend. It's pretty tricky to put something like this in the corner, but I think it works here because visually I am traveling down here and coming back around and going through and landing in the buildings. So I think that the composition is very well thought out. I think that that hazy sky is just perfect. Without it, I think the picture would have been overwhelming with too much going on. But with the hazy sky, it calms it down. I think it's beautifully done.
Erie?
Reverie.
Reverie? What the heck's reverie? I don't even know what that is.
It's like a dream.
A dream, okay, dream.
Keep it simple, Stu.
Yeah, I never heard that one before.
Well, see, we all learn something.
I guess.
12 points. The idea of making a long exposure on the water, making it smooth and dreamy-like, and the reflections are still enough that they maintain but have that soft, dreamy-like quality. Dreamy-like? That
Dreamy
works?
like.
That works.
Reverie right, like.
If you got down just a little bit farther, then the tops of these, whatever, pylons or whatever the heck they are, would be above the trees and not quite merging with them. Or if you were standing just a little bit taller, they would be below it. And honestly, if I were shooting it, I might try both ways. I think that I would like the down lower because I like this, where it's clearly above the background and here. Whereas here and here, that bothers me a little bit. So getting a little bit lower would get rid of that. And the yellow is just a hair intense for my personal comments, but you know, you get stuck with judges' personal likes and such. So take that with a grain of salt.
Logan Run Waterfall.
Long exposures, we do waterfalls. Really tricky doing long exposure waterfalls during the middle of the day. Oh, I gotta give a number, don't I? I hate giving numbers. 11. The composition is nice with the waterfall coming through here and going up. Again, the exposure though, we've got blown out areas, which is just so easy to do with a long exposure, especially in the middle of the day. The bright area right there. Even given those, if this were my image and you could bring back those highlights, I would put a vignette on it so that we darken the sides here and here. It's nice to have the information of the trees and what's around the waterfall, but you don't want it to compete. And in this case, there's so much detail there that it's competing. So the solution is to just dodge and burn it, well, burning obviously, or vignette to darken it down.
Midstream reflection.
This is really nicely done. Sometimes when you can get colors reflecting in the water on top of a rock in the water, you just get some really wild, wild results. And I think that this is very eye-catching. The rest of it is, the background supports the subject. The only one thing that I would do a little differently is in your presentation, that orange stroke is calling a little more attention to orange than needs to be. You've already got very intense orange in the image here and up here. You don't need any more orange. And if you did put orange, it should be more like that tone, very soft. So it's not stark white, just towards orange, but you don't need this kind of color.
Harbor Magic.
$13 points. It's always fun when you stop down and you get the starbursts to add some life to the image, and they kind of take us through the image and the reflections. I assume the long exposure part is that you stopped down long enough that it was, at least needed to be on a tripod maybe. One thing that I'm not crazy about is this part in the lower right. Those of you who have heard me before know I'm usually not too crazy about triangles and corners. They have to really be there for a reason, and I'm not sure that this one is adding a lot. Doesn't bother me as much as some, but I'm not sure that it's adding.
Montana Stream.
$12 points. So this one, actually, well, see, that's what I hate about numbers, because now I would have changed it back to 11, and I was debating 11 to 12. But you could, what, I can change it, 11 points, because we still have the blown out area here from the long exposure, and we have two problems, and that is with the background so much in focus and taking up half the image. I don't know if the story you're telling me is about the trees or about the waterfall. Now, theoretically, since the assignment is long exposure, I'm assuming that this is the part of the image where I'm supposed to be staying. But because this is light bright and has details, I'm going up here. The solution, you needed less space devoted to the trees and more to the foreground here, as well as you can open up a little bit, you can vignette, etc.
The falls in the summer.
Did everybody hear Patty? Patty said that she's very glad that she didn't put falls in. Okay, so what am I going to say, everybody? Yeah.
Background's too bright.
So this one I am going to go with a 12 for, because I think the composition is stronger. We know that clearly that the subject is the falls, but once again, it's really the really tough thing about doing long exposures on waterfalls. Overcast days help early in the morning, late in the afternoon, those falls that are in shadow. All of those things help. When you've got bright sun, really tough to avoid this. So do it several times and check your histogram. The other thing is that I would maybe have this one stop more open. I mean, we could use at least one stop more blur up here in an ideal world. But you can see how already by the background not being as in focus and occupying less of the image, it's less distracting.
Waterfall. The same memo. Yeah, everybody got the same memo?
The next time you do a long exposure as your assigned subject, you put in there, and you can't do a waterfall. Okay, actually 13. This is really nicely done. If you notice, we've got detail throughout, and this is a very long exposure. In an ideal world, the exposure would be just a hair, not quite as long, so you have just a hint more detail in that water, but the lack of detail is just from the amount of time. It's not from a problem with the exposure. And what is strong also is the little bit of white and water motion here that leads up here and the angles that lead us through. So I think it's nicely composed.
Pennsylvania Peaceful Waterfall.
And by now, I really don't have to judge it because you got it, right?
Well, you gotta give it a number.
I got to give it a number. That's really unfortunate. As it is, a 10. If I could take the image and make it from here to here, make this little panorama, this little sub-image, you'd probably have a 13. You have all kinds of lovely detail, just a little bit of hint of background there. That would be lovely. But what takes away from all that, the hugely overexposed area, the hugely underexposed area, the actual composition of this going through here, if we had an exposure that worked, might be very strong. You can try an HDR in this kind of case so that you can not block up your shadows so much, and so that you can shoot it so that you don't lose your highlights. Yeah, really tricky. So parts of this are done beautifully.
After the rain, cedar falls.
You should hear the comments around me. I'm tempted to just stick the microphone around me. Okay, 12 points. So you all already know that that's an issue, right?
Yes.
Okay, but what's really strong in this image is the person, the little person here, and this triangle that leads us over to the waterfall and up. And I don't think that this part of the waterfall necessarily adds anything. Bless you. And I might be inclined to see it with a crop or with this burned down, so that it's darkened, and so not quite as much a part of the image. Because the really strong part is this triangle, the little person leading over to the waterfall, which is beautifully placed over there.
Waves and sunset.
Oh my. 10 points. So if we didn't have that sky in there and we were just looking at this water, that would be beautiful. The water is actually beautifully done. We have all kinds of detail. We have motion. It's very intriguing. And that's supposed to be my subject. But then we come up to the sky. Now we've stopped down, so we've got starbursts coming for the sun. And as nature will have it, because of the clouds, it looks like we're on a planet with two suns, but, sometimes we are. And the clouds, the detail in the clouds is what's killing the picture. Because this picture is not supposed to be about the clouds. At least I don't think it's supposed to be about the clouds. And if it is, then we need to crop the picture around here and get rid of all this stuff in the foreground so that the picture is about the clouds. But right now, they're fighting each other. One's not complementing each other, which is what you need. So if you look actually over just to the right third half of the image, where the clouds have a little less going on, you can see how much stronger it is than over here where there's so much going on.
Around and around and around.
12 points. This is beautifully done. Capturing the rides with the long exposure gives all kinds of lovely colors and different effects. And that's very dramatic. But what's fighting it in this case, and what I think made several people around me go, barf, 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 also is the lens distortion, the wide angle distortion that's occurring here, in addition to the sense of motion, is actually making it a little harder to look at and to know where to land. Because in order to get your long exposure, you stop down to, I'm guessing, f16 or thereabouts. How do I know that? Because this is in focus and so's that. That's sharp back there. Honestly, you don't want the stuff back there sharp. When your subject is this, and this, and this, you need to get your long exposure by getting your ISO down to 50 or 100, whatever your camera will do, and shooting still at f5.6, f4, f2.8, whatever your lens is, whatever you're going to do. And then if you still need to get a longer exposure, you can put a polarizing filter on. You can put a neutral density filter on. You can do any of those things that make it so that you take more time. You can do things other than F16, F22. Because you got to think, do I really want my audience to be looking at the people back here and the buildings back here? I don't think so.
Dizzy.
This was taken after the last one? 13 points. I think that I'm like people around me, I don't know exactly what it is, but that's okay. I don't have to know exactly what it is. It's eye-catching, it has impact. I do think the corner up here has more impact with the purer colors than down here where it gets very, very muted. You might go for a little bit more contrast in this area to brighten it up, but uniquely seen and done. And again, that bright yellow, your yellow doesn't have to be the same yellow as in your image. Imagine that that was off-white yellow, so that it complements it, but it's not trying to be part of the image. It's not saying, hey, include me too.
Two seconds of spinning.
$15. For your 2 seconds of spinning, you nailed it. You know, you got it really beautifully done. The composition on this is just really, really perfect. But notice how the lines lead us in to the movement, and the movement is working. All of the lines, all of the angles in this work really, really nicely.
After dark on the bay.
$11 points. I think it's an interesting idea to do a long exposure on the bay and get some of the reflections of the color and see inside the building. But if we're going to see inside the building, then we need to see inside the building and not have blown out area, or we need to not see inside the building, you know, one or the other. The other thing is that I think we've got some processing stuff going on over here. We've got a dirt spot there, but we've also got noise that came from something and some splotchiness from the way it was processed.
Electric banjo.
Are you telling me somebody light painted this? 30? So give it a 15 and give it another 15. I honestly, to be able to take a flashlight or whatever you have that emits light and create something that specifically, I mean, that's beautifully done and conceived. More power to you. I wish I knew how to do it.
I can tell you how we did it.
So,
Later.
no, let's do it right now.
What, who is it, Tracy?
My husband, he has a banjo and he has a green pointer and he ran it along the edges of it and then he drew the strings. And then at the top on the bedroom wall, he drew the lines and then drew the notes. I could have never done that, but he sees that stuff and he's very good at it.
So she gets 15 and he gets 15.
Well, there you go. Thank you. Did everybody hear? That's awesome. Thank you.
Snow Festival fireworks.
10 points. Fireworks are nice for long exposures, but usually you try and get some different focal points so that you have different bursts and know where to look. Right now, this is just more of an overall pattern that might work beautifully as a background for something, but as an image on its own, I'm not sure that it holds.
Barge in the harbor.
£14. This is really, really striking. And with a different projector or screen, it might be a 15. My only thought is that we need to be able to see the separation here in the shadows just a hair more. The light is so bright here that it affects us seeing the difference in the darkness. But this is just beautifully conceived and composed and really nicely done.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for for showing it, honestly.
Life is a highway.
Who's standing in the middle of the highway? Somebody suicidal in this room.
You stood in the middle of a runway.
Details.
That's just, they're on an overpass.
Um, $12, 13 points. See, I changed my mind. I'm female, I'm allowed. I really like the composition of this with it coming from both sides and converging, as well as an off-ramp. I mean, the location that you've chosen for this is really a good one. It might have been nice if they had been obliging enough to stick another light over here someplace.
There's all woods on that side.
Well, nobody said that was allowed. You know, that's one of those judges kind of comments that's like, but reality interferes and says that that's not possible.
Yeah, but would you have put a light there?
I might have put a light there, but I might not have. The thing I might have done, though, instead, is to come up and take a little of the foreground away and a little off the right then. I would have at least experimented with doing that to see how it looked, and maybe a little bit of the dark. I mean, I would just play with the crop a little bit. We just have a very, very large, very black area here, which is what I would be trying to see if I could do something about. And since there's also kind of an empty area here, I would experiment with it.
Harrisburg Moat Bridge.
$13 points. I think that it's a nice long exposure with some soft cloud motion and the softness in the water, the reflections of the light. The one thing that I think makes this not a 14 or a 15 is that it's actually too bright. We know it's probably dusk or blue hour or later because we've got the lights on and we can see the reflection of the colors, and we see lights on in the buildings here. And so that's the clue to us that this is taken during darkness. But the exposure is so long that it looks like daylight, and that's actually a little bit disconcerting.
Hello.
Hello. You know that ghost that I
Yeah.
gave?
It
There.
just came in.
Yep.
Twilight on the Bay.
$12 points. There are some elements of this that are beautifully done. The motion in the water, the colors of the sky, the little sliver of moon, stars, that's all beautifully done. The catch is that the city became so dark because it's so late when you're getting this. One of the tricks to getting pictures like this is to take this part of the shot, during the blue hour, after the sun is set and the lights are on, but it's not super, super dark yet, so that you get a little bit more detail in those shadows. I'm also not sure about this one bright reflection here, because I keep going down and visiting it and then going, but wait a minute, what's over here? But that's not really part of the story. So that's distracting me a little bit.
Twilight in Cleveland.
$14 and I think you ought to sell it to the Cleveland Chamber of Commerce. This part of the cloud feels like it's just a little bit too bright up there, but the composition is strong. It's coming in the angles and the softness of the water and the nice reflections. The framing of the clouds here is beautiful. I think that there's a lot of strength in this, and I'm not kidding. You ought to see if you can sell it to Cleveland.
In a galaxy far, far away.
It's actually not that far away. 13 points. What I'm struggling with a little bit is I love how the one star actually became a star. That gives us a landing point in addition to the Milky Way. The vignetting and darkness down here, it's okay. The picture is basically a monochrome without being a monochrome. The blue is very intensely blue. And I keep thinking that if the blue were slightly desaturated so that it wasn't so much about, hey, it's blue out here, it might be even stronger. It doesn't have to be a full monochrome, but it can just be slightly less. I do think the composition is well done, where you've put the horizon line and the framing where you have the trees going off to the right and an area and another little area. I think that's very strong.
Miller Bell Tower.
$14. Great composition, leads us around. The one thing is this is so bright and strong that right here, notice that it's blown out. You have to be really careful with that, because when you get those blown out areas, they pull your attention and then kind of grab us there. I don't think it's terrible here, that's why it's 14, but it would be a 15 if it weren't blown out there.
Cedar Falls.
I thought Cedar Falls was an amusement park.
Cedar Point.
Oh, Cedar Falls.
Sea
Okay, I'll look more accurately, thank you. Okay. 13 points, we have mostly good detail in here. I think that this is probably, at least it looks like a similar waterfall to one we've seen before. But we've got nice detail in places, the composition is good. So yeah, that works.
Erie at dawn.
I really want to take the microphone and just put it around me. Okay, 11 points. The composition is good, but what I feel like happened here is that this was a much darker image and that you lightened it up. I'm guessing that because, A, the colors are a little weird. We've got this extreme graininess going on through here. I think that this might have actually been a lot stronger if it had been left darker as it was without quite as much difference. Because we've got so many horizontal lines, and then we've got vertical lines, and then we've got details, and then we've got more stuff. So that there's just so much going on, we have to tone it down a little bit. I think if we had this darker, probably as dark as the image may have originally been, or at least close to it, that it would be a little stronger. Uh-oh, somebody's complaining that their picture wasn't shown. When you
What's
find
that?
it, send it to me. You too can be slaughtered.
I'll look at it.
Whoops.
There's a method to my madness.
No, I'll have her address.
Is anyone else missing one? All right, so
Okay, our winner for our bronze is Barbara Klaproth and Christine French and Debbie Nukowski.
What are all you bronze shooters doing getting 13?
Silver, 15 for Bill Dorsch. In gold, a 15 for Olivia Narulu. Diamond, we have a 14 for John Bishop and Candy Faligi and Melinda Isaacson. And in platinum, we have a 15 for Becky Samler and for Bob Grubbs and for Gail Winslow.